Look at a Renaissance masterpiece. The marble is perfect, the proportions are divine. But if you look closely at the forces that actually paid for this explosion of beauty, you'll find a trail of blood. Behind the genius of figures like Leonardo da Vinci and the early humanists were some of the most violent, paranoid, and ruthless despots in European history. Look at Europe in the 14th century. While France and England consolidated into unified monarchies, the Italian peninsula was shattered. The Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor fought to a standstill, leaving a massive power vacuum. Without a strong central king or religious authority to keep order, the old feudal rules simply stopped applying. In this fractured landscape, ultimate power belonged entirely to anyone willing to take it by force. The men who stepped into this void were often condottieri, mercenary captains for hire, or ruthless local nobles who saw an opening. They seized control of individual city-states through betrayal, bribery, and brute military strength. But stealing a city created an immediate, glaring problem. Because these new rulers had no royal bloodlines and no divine blessing from the church, their reigns were completely illegitimate in the eyes of the law. That illegitimacy bred a constant, suffocating paranoia. A usurper knew that since he took the throne by violence, a cousin, a rival general, or an angry mob could take it from him the exact same way. They slept in fortified castles, constantly dodging poison and daggers. Military force alone cannot hold a stolen city forever. These despots realized they needed to engineer a new form of public consent, a way to make their rule feel permanent without the benefit of royal blood. The historian Jacob Burckhardt called their solution the state as a work of art. For the first time, rulers began to view government as something to be deliberately calculated, designed, and managed from the ground up to ensure their own survival. The first step in this calculation was controlling the narrative. Despots began aggressively recruiting poets, scholars, and early humanists to their courts. In a world where a ruler couldn't claim a divine right to rule, fame became a practical political currency. Writers were the only people who could distribute that currency, dictating how a tyrant was perceived by rivals and remembered by history. Look at this fresco of the Gonzaga court. Court poets and painters were paid handsomely to stage and depict these warlords as wise fathers of the people, framing them as the intellectual peers of ancient Roman emperors. By monopolizing the intellectual class, these rulers built a shield of cultural legitimacy. They bought the allegiance of the smartest minds of their generation to ensure their violent takeovers were recorded as acts of rightful, enlightened authority. But words on parchment only went so far. These rulers also weaponized physical space, using colossal architecture to project absolute dominance over the public. This is the facade of the Milan Cathedral, initiated under the despot Gian Galeazzo Visconti. His building projects routinely exceeded all normal civic proportions, altering the landscape itself on a scale no single medieval ruler had attempted. You see this again in the incredibly intricate, expensive marble detailing of the Certosa di Pavia. These impossibly costly projects signaled unshakable financial credit, telling potential rebels that this ruling family was wealthy enough to outlast any insurrection. These massive structures functioned as fortresses of psychological warfare. They were engineered to use sheer scale to convince subjects that the state was too large and too permanent to ever challenge. The final piece of this calculated legitimacy was moving the propaganda out of the palaces and into the streets through multi-million-dollar public festivals known as the Triunfo, or Triumph. When King Alfonso conquered Naples, he commissioned this classical Roman triumphal arch, strategically wedging it directly between the heavy, brutal stones of a medieval military fortress to emphasize his new imperial identity. These street parades functioned like a solar system. Chariots with actors playing classical gods orbited a single center of gravity, the despot himself. This spectacle pulled the entire populace into that orbit, manufacturing a shared civic mythology the masses were forced to inhabit. By wrapping themselves in the mythos of invincible ancient Rome, these usurpers made their sudden, violent rise to power feel ancient and inevitable. The calculus worked. These brute force regimes survived by successfully masquerading as the most enlightened cultural centers in Europe, hiding their brutality behind a veil of high art. Look at this portrait of Lodovico Sforza. He was a man who quietly ordered a respectable citizen to be strangled in the street simply because the man spoke out against a new tax. Yet, simultaneously, this same man hosted the most brilliant court in Europe and funded the unparalleled genius of Leonardo da Vinci. For rulers like Sforza, painting and assassination served the same function. He calculated his use of Leonardo da Vinci as carefully as he calculated his use of the gallows. Both were tools required to maintain the stability of his state. Renaissance tyrants bankrolled masterpieces to invent the first mechanisms of modern state propaganda. They discovered that by directing a nation's culture, they could dictate its sense of reality.